taxation under what we've been working on under this utilitarian framework that's usually called the Merle's framework, given the empirical estimates we have, calls for very strong redistribution of wealth and a very progressive tax system, right? Now, even stronger tensions between the tax system that exists in the world in most countries, in the United States, for example, and what optimal tax theory would call for is going to arise when we consider richer policies as, who was it that asked about it? Was it you, Sebastian? You asked about if we can tax other things than just income. Yeah, so remember, if possible, we don't really want to tax people based on income. We'd rather just tax people based on how much income they'll end up earning if we could know that without actually seeing their income. Because if we could do that, there wouldn't be any distortion, right? People wouldn't be able to change their behavior in order to reduce how much they earned if we could just charge them based on what they'll end up earning rather than what they actually have earned, right? So we use an income tax instead because we think we can't observe people's potential earnings, right? If we could observe people's potential earnings, we'd just charge them a tax based on that, because then there would be no distortion, right? Now, there are lots of traits that people have which indicate whether they're likely to earn a lot of money or not earn a lot of money that we might be able to use in place of taxing them based on income. And Sebastian, what are some of those traits? What are traits that would indicate whether someone is likely to be? What? What they consume. Well, but if we tax that, that's going to change their behavior. I mean, maybe, but that's a little bit tougher. But what are things that people can't change about themselves that can tell us quite a bit about how well off they're going to end up being? And how much they inherit from their parents. Yeah, so that might do it too, though. If you tax that, that might lead their parents not to work as hard, right? But there's other things that you really can't change that we know have a big prediction on income. Can you think of anything like that? IQ. That's a great example. Height is another good example. Another great example, actually, it turns out one of the strongest predictors of income is how patient people are as kids. So if you go to a kid and you say, would you be willing to give up having one cookie now for getting 2 cookies in an hour? That's like one of the most powerful predictors of your income later in life. Beauty is another very strong predictor. And you might think beauty's in the eye of the beholder. That's just not true. So there are very objective, simple scientific tests you can do on beauty that are extremely strong predictors of people's income later in life. IQ, health, race and ethnicity, disabilities, unemployment, those are things which maybe you can affect a little bit, but are pretty hard to affect and that have a big predictive power on your income. If we tax these things rather than taxing income, we can redistribute without discouraging people from working. And this is the principle behind a paper that George Akerlof wrote in 1978. And all these things have come to be called tagging. So tagging are different ways in which, based on things other than income, we can predict what income people are likely to earn. And that allows us to charge them lower marginal taxes on income while giving them subsidies or charging them taxes based on their expected income based on these characteristics. And this is a crucial and very controversial principle of optimal utilitarian taxation. Now, one case study of this was analyzed by Greg Mankiw and Matt Weinzierl. So they said, suppose that we were going to tax people based on their height. This is a strong but imperfect predictor of their wages. And they calculate, using this process very similar to what we just did, what the optimal tax and redistribution would be based on this. And they break men into 3 categories. Men below 5'10" are short and should receive about a 14% subsidy. Men who are between 5'10" and 6 feet should pay about a 4% tax. And men who are tall should pay about 7% tax. Why? That's a complicated question. You'd have to ask a social psychologist about that. But I mean, one reason is, people are intimidated by people who are taller. They think they're more handsome. They're better at doing physical. I mean, there's many different reasons for this, but it turns out it's a very strong predictor. Think about the discussion we were having above. It was very similar to a monopoly problem, right? Except that you cared a little bit about the welfare of the person who's the monopolist, right? Because you didn't want to raise taxes too much because then you discourage income by a lot, but you wanted to raise them some in order to raise some revenue, right? And in some sense, this tagging is really just has the same relationship to that as third-degree price discrimination has to the monopoly problem, right? And there's lots of other policies that are in this vein as well, like we talked about. So many people, let me show you the graph of this just so you see it, to see the way in which height affects income. So this is a graph of the distribution of income among short, medium, and tall people. And you see if you get towards the top end of the mean hourly wage, tall people are way overrepresented. If you get to the bottom end, short people are way overrepresented, and medium people are in between. Okay. Now, a lot of people react very negatively to this notion of taxing height. They think it violates a principle of what they call horizontal equity, which is some notion that everyone who earns the same income should pay the same taxes. And Weinzierl, who is also the author of this paper, formalized this by a principle of what he called equal sacrifice, which is that everyone should receive the same reduction in the level of utility in order to fund social services, rather than us redistributing to maximize utilitarian welfare necessarily. And notice that that's going to be violated by these horizontally inequitable things. Because people who are in the end earning the same income will end up paying different taxes based on these things which are not related to income. So that's going to violate the principle of equal sacrifice, that everyone should experience the same reduction in income, in utility in order to pay for public services. Now, I don't know if you guys find that a compelling principle, but that's one possible reason why you might not want to have this type of tagging. Okay. Now, a similar logic to tagging, another reason, so notice that tagging is going to lead to something other than us just taxing income. It's going to lead us to treating different people differently. So it starts to give some sort of a justification for why we might do things like Sebastian was saying of, giving special subsidies to some types of people, having unemployment insurance, giving various types of benefits, right? Another reason is that taxing different things can help encourage work, right? Now, how could we encourage work by taxing or subsidizing certain goods? Can anyone think of how we could do that? Juan Rojas, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so for example, if we put taxes on vacations, if we think that vacations are complementary with leisure, that might help reduce the amount that people want to take leisure or travel. Or we could subsidize things that are complementary with work or earning a lot of income, such as getting a good education or being healthy. So this allows us to maximize the productivity of the workforce, right? And it's really quite similar to tagging. The reason is that we can sort of infer that someone who is tall but not earning that much income is likely to be slacking off. That's sort of the idea, right? And so if we tax someone who's tall but not working that hard more, that's basically like taxing something which is complementary with leisure. We sort of know that he's taking a lot of leisure if he's tall and still not earning that much income. And this is sort of this tagging or leisure complements thing is the fundamental principle of non-uniform taxation. When you hear economists talk about almost any sort of not externality-based taxation or subsidy, it's almost certainly based on these principles. And really, this is the same as an externality principle. Why is it the same as it? Because when I don't work, because some of my work ends up paying for taxes that fund other people, I'm imposing an externality on society when I don't work. So this is really a very similar principle. So the two principles are you should tax those who are more able, and you should encourage work by taxing leisure substitutes, taxing leisure complements, subsidizing leisure substitutes. And these are the two basic caveats to the second welfare theorem's conclusion that we should have taxation mostly based on income, which we actually didn't get a chance to talk about. And much of tax theory is an attempt to work out these basic principles. But sort of any sort of public finance problem you think about usually comes down to either the optimal income tax analysis we talked about before, or these two principles of tagging and encouraging work. Okay. Now, what's one example of that? Capital gains taxation. So taxing savings may be justified by one of these two principles. But usually, economists think it's bad. And Sergio, why do most economists think that taxing capital is a bad idea? Yeah, so they say that it distorts consumption across periods. And why should we do that? That's not necessarily obviously related to working harder or less hard, whether you want to consume today or tomorrow. And in fact, capital taxes can accumulate over the long term. So the thing is that it may not be a large distortion between consumption today and tomorrow, but if I have a 1% capital tax forever, that's going to end up making the distortion between consuming today and in 100 years very large, right? The other reason why I usually argue that capital taxation is not a good idea is that I think that there's a lot of people who like getting rich, not because they want to consume anything, but just because they like being rich, right? And I think that you should pat those people on the back, because that's great, right? They're accumulating all this money. They're not taking any consumption goods out of the society. All this money is being put back into productive uses that are creating jobs for people, right? If someone wants to just accumulate wealth and then maybe it gets taxed away when they die, I mean, that's just a bonanza for society. So I think capital tax discourages people like that because they don't get to stack as many chips, right? And so I tend to be sympathetic to having low capital taxes because I think there's a lot of people that are sort of like that. We should tax a lot consumption, not so much capital, because it encourages people just to accumulate a lot of wealth. Okay. Now, why might how could the logic of the things we discussed above potentially justify capital taxation? Nancy, can you think of how tagging and taxing leisure complements could justify capital taxation? Yeah. How could tagging or taxing leisure complements justify capital taxation? Does anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, Roman. That's a possibility. I've never actually heard that argument before, but that's a possibility. The more common reasons are the following. So I know that taxes are progressive under the optimal system, right? So one thing I could do to game that system would be to save up money in years when I've earned a lot so that I don't have to work so hard when I'm looking like I might earn a lot in the future, right? So I can sort of game the progressivity of the tax system by trying to make my income more flat over time. And I can use savings to do that. So is that all that plausible of a thing that people would do? I don't know. But that has been used by some people to justify why you might want to tax savings. Another reason why you might want to tax savings, that's the third reason. I think perhaps a more important reason is that savings can be a form of avoiding income taxation. So one thing that a lot of the super rich do is that they find a way to get their companies, rather than giving them money, to give them like some form of stock at a really low valuation. So they pay income taxes on that really low valuation, and then suddenly they get a huge capital gain on that thing, right? And that's not really a capital gain. It's really a form of labor income. And more generally, if someone spends a lot of time trying to figure out what's the right stocks to invest in, that's really a form of labor income. It's not a form of capital income, because they're putting time into figuring it out. So to really tax the labor income on that, you have to have a capital tax, right? Another way to put it is you can imagine having no capital tax on earning just like the interest rate, but having a tax on earning income that's above the interest rate, right? And that would be sort of a way to avoid this sort of gaming of the system. Another thing is that it may be that people who are more talented like to save more. Now, I actually think there's some limited evidence that this is true, but it's not very strong. My guess is that to some extent it's actually the opposite. Because if you think you're going to make a lot of money later on in life, you might want to actually borrow a lot now to consume more now, rather than saving a lot. So it's not obvious, actually, that that the more able people, not wealthy, that the more able people actually, on average, are going to save more. So that doesn't seem to me to be a very good justification for taxing capital. There's also this story that I just told you before, which is that you can even out your labor income using savings, which I don't think is a very compelling story either. So overall, this is a popular, very popular, there's been a ton written on this in recent years, an open question. I think that, to me, the main trade-off is you want to encourage people to do this chip stacking thing, but on the other hand, it's pretty easy to avoid a lot of types of capital labor taxation if you don't have a capital tax. So I think that, to me, that's the most important trade-off. But all these other factors have been talked about by other people. Okay. Now, one puzzle is that in the future, it's going to become increasingly easy to tag people. And the reason is that the information technology is making it increasingly possible to get incredibly detailed information about people. So Google knows tons of stuff about your preferences. And in fact, I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but if you go on google.com/something like advertising profile, it'll tell you exactly what your income profile is, and like where you are in life, what you're doing, etc. And they've figured that all just from your searches. They know all this stuff about you. And this, I think, can give a very clear sense of leisure complements, of things that you might use to tag people, etc. Biotechnology is giving us an increasingly clear sense of the determinants of people's income, success, and life. So we know more and more genetic markers of eventual success. And that will give us much better ways to tag people. And height, on the other hand, is very coarse compared to all the things that genetics is pretty soon going to be able to tell us. So, and even within standard income tax models, one of the main deterrents to charging a high tax was this problem of evasion and loopholes. And technology is going to make it increasingly possible to track what people are doing and to figure out whether they're evading, and thereby to reduce the possibilities of evasion. And this is, I think, going to increasingly erase the equity-efficiency trade-off that we've been talking about. Because of the increased ability to avoid evasion and the increased ability to tag, I think it's going to, the utilitarian logic is going to lead us increasingly to almost perfect equality. So I think that increasingly in the future, it's going to be possible to implement what Marx was hoping for. And so the question, I think, that's most important is, if we can do that, is that the world we actually all want to be living in? Because that's the world that our models are going to lead us to say we want to live in. Okay. So I'm now going to try to go through a whole bunch of reasons why maybe that's not the world we want to move towards. Maybe it is. And in fact, I think there's a compelling argument that it is. But there's a lot more richness than what's included in the Merle's model. The sort of sad thing about optimal income tax theory over the last 30 years is people spent all their time thinking about this one very narrow model. And you'll see that there's so many more things that enter into thinking about, what sort of tax system we all want to have. Okay. So the veil of ignorance is based on the logic that sort of everyone ex ante has an equal chance of being anyone in the world. But the question is, who is anyone when we say anyone? Whose shoes can I imagine walking in? Is it all people who are currently in my country? I mean, does that seem to you, Danielle, what do you think about that? Does that seem to you to be the right notion of who should be behind the veil of ignorance? Yeah. Well, yeah, so I mean, but if that's true, then the whole framework we were talking about is sort of wrong, actually. Why is that? Well, if you can be anyone from all over the world, then we shouldn't be doing income tax on a national basis. We should be doing it on a global basis, right? So that's kind of problematic, right? And in fact, if that were really true, every government under the Merle's model should not be just taxing its people and redistributing within its country. It should be spending a huge fraction of their budget on foreign aid, right? So that's already a point where this framework really doesn't make sense. The Merle's model, if you interpret it that way, doesn't really make sense as a way of thinking about domestic taxes. Yeah, Gabrielle, I was about to call on you. Just opine. Tell me what you think. Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah.
No, I was thinking that there is a lot of policy for poor countries and all this, for the rich countries. The United Nations has it, World Bank has it in the way a lot of people have it, and also the private sector has it. So there is some way of trying to correct that.
I agree with.
By this logic, agreements between the nations, the United Nations,
So
give 1% of their taxes or of their product to.
So I agree with what you said, except for the word "a lot." So, remember when I showed you the figures on inequality? We said that 2/3 of all inequality is across countries rather than within countries. So what that says is that so if you just do the calculations we were doing above, that would say that 2/3 of taxes raised should be going to foreign aid in a typical country in the world. And in the rich countries, probably much more than 2/3. So that's just not even calibrationally, that's not even remotely close to what we do. I mean, about 2/3 of taxes in an average country in the world should go to foreign aid. And in the rich countries, it should be dramatically more than that, right? So currently, the United States gives about 0.5% of GDP. Sorry, not 0.5% of taxes raised, which is about, isn't that right, Leash? No? 0.4% of GDP. So that's a little bit more than 0.5%. Yeah, 0.4% of GDP. So, and we were saying that tax rates should be something like 70%. If there was more inequality, it should be even higher than that. So we should have like 80% taxes all over the world, and like 2/3 of that should be going to other countries. That would be what the Murley's model would predict about global inequality, right? So that cannot possibly be what's going on in our tax systems, right? I mean, that's just wildly off, right?
But what I'm trying to say, I know you're right.
Yeah.
It's very small in the context of the problem of this, but there is a lot of movement towards it. Yeah,
Again, maybe directionally that's true. I'm not even sure if it's directionally true, but it's definitely not a lot. I mean, I don't think you understand the orders of magnitude here. 0.4% of GDP, multiply that by 10, you get 4% of GDP. Multiply that by 10, you get 40% of GDP. And then double that, and you're getting close to about what the model predicts, right? So we're like 2.5 orders of magnitude off from what the model would say that you should do if you really took it seriously. So I just don't think we're even remotely close to that. I mean, what we do is a token. We do a token so we feel good. It has nothing to do with what the Murley's model would predict, right? Yet nobody seems to be serious about doing this. Even Emmanuel Saez, who's the most religious devotee of the Murley's model, doesn't seem to be advocating this sort of a world. So we could go even further. What about people who aren't even born yet? Should they be behind the veil of ignorance? Should we include future generations? What if our actions affect people who aren't yet born yet? What if they affect which people get born? I don't know. It gets pretty complicated. So the question is, where could, but for the grace of God, I end up? In fact, what we see in practice is most people draw the line much, much, much more narrowly than that. So we saw that inequality across countries was much bigger than equality within countries, but in reality, people care a lot more about people who are emotionally or physically close to them. And while that may sound callous, the truth is, where would you personally draw the line? Sebastian, do you think it's reasonable for you to care more about taking care of people in your family than to take care of someone in Africa? If you didn't, you probably wouldn't be living life the way that you are living life, right?
I think that an example of my country. So we have too much things to care here, like the gorilla, the internal war, the civil war we're having. So it will be like first take care of all the aspects, not only the inequalities, but take care of all the social aspects we have. Then we can think like, okay, it's time to help other people.
Yeah, well, I mean, so this is a very difficult issue, right? So on the one hand, I think everyone feels that they have a right to take better care of their family than to take care of any person in the world. But on the other hand, how about your extended family? Do you have a right to take more care of them? Do you have a right to take more care of your tribe? So like, all the people who are in any way related to you. How about a race? People who look like you or have similar physical characteristics or are genetically similar to you. How about a nation? Do you have more rights to take care of them? Okay, you might say, yes, I do. But then what do you think about racism? What do you think about, the Germans who thought that Germans were more valuable than other types of people? I don't know. I mean, it gets pretty tricky, right? So regardless of what you think normatively, there seems to be overwhelming evidence that this matters in practice to the way that people actually redistribute. So if you take the factors that we were looking about, the amount of inequality and the elasticity of labor supply, and you try to measure those across countries, they do a very poor job describing the variation across countries and the amount of redistribution. On the other hand, if you measure how homogeneous countries are in terms of their ethnic makeup, that does a tremendously good job of describing how much countries redistribute. And in fact, even within the United States, if you look at the percentage of black people in a given state, that's one of the strongest predictors of how large of a welfare state they have. The more black people there are, the smaller the welfare state is in the state. So this raises some, I think, pretty challenging issues from our normative perspective. The question is, should we consider that? Is that a legitimate part? Should we have models that explain why normatively that would happen? Or is this bad? Or how should we look at it? If it's bad, how do we square that with the fact that we do feel we should take more care of our family and our extended family than we should of other people? I don't know. And secondly, imagine we do think that this is bad, that we should try to get rid of these types of preferences that people have. Well, then we know that there's going to be a trade-off. Because if you have a country that's very diverse, that is going to reduce the extent that people are going to want to redistribute. Now, we know that most inequality is across countries rather than within countries. So think about it. Actually, if we have a lot more immigration, say into the United States, that's going to reduce the extent that people are going to want equality within a country. But we know that most inequality is across countries rather than within countries. So that actually might be a more important way, allowing immigration to reduce global inequality. And it might be worth accepting the reduction in internal inequality in order to allow more migration that reduces global equality. So I think that this is actually one of the most fundamental trade-offs that so there's two perspectives you can take. One perspective is, no, we really should care more about people who are like us in various senses. But if you take the other perspective and say, no, we should really strive to be equal to all people in the world, there's a fundamental trade-off you're going to face given the nature that people in the world actually are, which is that the more diversity you have within a country, the more open a country is to immigration and to different types of people, which is really the way to reduce inequality in the world overall, the less equality people are going to want to have within that country. Yeah, go ahead, Oscar.
That's correct. I mean, you can have both. I mean, at the same time, you cannot reduce equality and at the same time have no.
Well, I think as a matter of fact, it seems like it's not the case. So here's a graph. So this shows race fractionalization on the horizontal axis, and this shows the percentage of GDP which is in social spending programs. And there's an extremely strong negative trend. So in fact, actually, the United States is above the trend line. So the US actually, you might say, US has so little redistribution. What a terrible country we are. Couldn't we be like someone like, Iceland or Japan that redistributes a lot more? But it turns out that for the amount of race heterogeneity we have, the US redistributes a huge amount of money. You look at a country like Portugal or Finland. These countries are, the United Kingdom, which think that they're so much more progressive than the United States are. The reason is primarily because they have almost no ethnic heterogeneity. Yeah, Juan Castillo. Oh, these red colors are OECD countries, and the other countries are poor countries. But look, they're all part of a pretty similar trend. So the countries that tend to redistribute a lot are extremely homogeneous. Okay. So this preference that people have for people who are more similar to them or nearer to them, I think can lead to some pretty interesting paradoxes. So let me just propose to you one particular paradox. And the reason I'm posing this to you is not because I have any particular resolution to it, but I think that it forces you to reflect on what you really value. whether what you really value is this equality notion or what you value is just being around people who aren't so poor or something like that. Okay, so imagine the following scenario. There's two countries, a rich country and a poor country. And grant me the hypothesis that people care more about people who are physically or psychologically close to them than people who are physically or psychologically distant from them. Now, there's a Pareto improvement that's possible, which is that poor countries, people from the poor country, can go to work in the rich country for very little money. More money than they're earning in the poor country, but way, 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 way less than anyone makes in the rich country, right? And the reason why that's possible is because the people in the rich country care about other people in the in the rich country, so they don't let any of them live really badly, right? But they might allow someone from the poor country to migrate to the rich country, make more money than they have already, but way less than anyone in the rich country has, right? But there's a problem, which is that once that person from the poor country moves to the rich country, the people are going to start feeling sympathy for him and are not going to want to let him live on pennies, right? And so this policy is not really going to work, right? Once the people from the poor country come, we're going to feel bad for them and we're going to want to help them, right? So what that says is the fact that we feel this sympathy for them when they get close to us undermines something that could make everyone better off, right? So, Sebastian, can you see any way that we could solve this problem?
Making the people who work there, when it feels like the same as the richer people in the country, give some money to its native country.
Well, but that won't really solve the problem because the rich people still won't want to bring them there because they will know that they'll end up... The fundamental problem is the rich people don't want to bring the poor people there because they know that once the poor people are there, that they're going to feel sympathy for them and they're not going to get their part of the Pareto improvement. You see what I mean? So the question is, how can we guarantee the people in the rich country their part of the Pareto improvement so we can get this immigration to take place? Can you see a way to make that happen? Well, but the problem is that once they get there, the people won't want to leave them. So how do we solve that? Danielle, do you have an idea? No? Gabrielle?
I don't think I'm going to answer the
Yeah.
question. What the theory of development says is the other way around. Try to take the conditions of the rich country to the poor country so that people won't have to go to the rich country in order to be okay, to feel well.
Yeah, and that worked great during the 20th century, didn't it?
No, I'm not saying it works. I'm saying that that's what it says.
Well, I think it worked about as well as foreign aid worked. I mean, yes, I agree. And directionally, there's some of that. But I don't think it solves the problem. So I don't think it solves the existence of this.
Well, I know it hasn't worked as it was supposed to, but it hasn't been that bad anyway, because let's say in Colombia we were very bad in the 60s and we're not very well now, but we're a lot better than...
Look, I'm not saying that there aren't some gains that can be made from all these types of things. I just don't think it changes this issue at all. I mean, look, inequality is 2/3 across countries and only 1/3 within countries. I mean, that's just not changing. I mean, look, yeah, is it good that we can develop? I'm not, all that stuff's good, but it doesn't change this fundamental problem. So let me propose a strategy that we could use. Or did anyone else want to? Oscar, yeah.
I was reading through the
Yeah.
slide, and basically what it seems to be try to propose is that basically people in the country can actually identify the poor people. So basically what you propose is like to do what the Germans did with the Jewish guys.
Yeah.
So they mark them and
Well, or let me, so imagine that we can put a mark on the head of people from poor countries, which says, this person came from the poor country, and it will be inherited by all their children. This person came from the poor country, right? And there comes to be a superstition that people who have this mark on their head are not really human beings, right? You don't need to have any sympathy for them. They're subhuman, and they can afford to live on these penny wages, which are much better than what they're earning in their old country, but are much worse than you would let any human being live in the rich country, right? So what's one form of mark on the head that gets passed on to children? Well, skin color, right? And imagine we establish a superstition that people who have different colored skin are not really human. That would make everyone better off. Why would it make everyone better off? Because it allows people to come from the poor country, work at higher wages than they were earning there, and yet no one will feel enough sympathy for them to bring them up to the level that would make it unattractive to try to bring them in as immigrants, right? But note that as we get physically close to one another, people are probably not going to believe the superstition for too long. Over time, people are going to learn that these people are actually human beings, right? And as they learn that they're human beings, they're not going to want to treat them like dirt, right? So the descendants of the people who invented this superstition will come to believe that their grandparents were terrible people because they treated these wonderful people who we live with who are, like crap, right? And yet despite that, without the racism of their forebears, not only would everyone be worse off, but in fact, they would never have come to feel the sympathy for these people that they currently feel for them. Those people would still be, say, in Africa or wherever else, and you would be treating them implicitly like even worse crap than they were treated in your country because you wouldn't feel you had any responsibilities to them at all. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the fact that we come to have more sympathy actually impedes the flow of immigration because people realize that if they bring these people, that eventually they'll have sympathy for their children, and that will make them less interested in bringing them. The grandchildren of the people think that their great-grandparents were these terrible people for having been racist, when in fact, without that racism, they would never have even thought to care about these people. Yeah, Sebastián. Sí, sí, está bien.
Mira, si esta marca, o sea, puede que lleguen al mismo rango de la gente rica, ¿cierto?
Sí.
Pero si esta marca nos obliga a que no se olvide de dónde viene y que este extra de salario que están ganando, como ya lo hemos visto, pues, bueno, para poder llegar al equivalente del bien mundial, lo que yo tengo que dar es como 2/3 de los impuestos sobre
sí.
que gano para todo el mundo. Entonces, esta gente que va al otro país, pues esa misma marca, no que los traten como pues, racistas ni nada de eso, sino que esta marca diga como, oiga, usted viene de este país, es su misión también pues, velar por el bien de su país. Entonces, uno de la diferencia que estaba ganando respecto a lo que ganaba en el país joven a lo que gana ahora, pues redistribúyalo por los suyos.
See, so it's clear that you can't solve all problems of inequality this way. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying you can make things better this way. That's all I'm saying. And I mean, look, that's a big enough problem already, I think, for a lot of ethical views that all of us hold, right? So this was a very extreme story. Was it an unrealistic story? Not such an unrealistic story necessarily, right? Yeah, I mean, and in fact, you could ask, if you just did a standard utilitarian calculation of the discounted present value of income and the way we've been talking about it so far, of people who are descendants of slaves that came to the United States versus people who are descendants of Africans who stayed in Africa, and I think you'd have to have a pretty weird discount rate not to come out with the slaves being better off. And how much immigration do we have from Africa now? Not so much. Think about what happened in the United States after we had the civil rights movement. So before the civil rights movement, there was this huge bracero program where tons of Mexicans came to the United States. And everyone was fine with that because they treated them like dirt. They paid them nothing. They had no civil rights. They had, they had no union organization, right? But lots of people came. Now there's all this organization, there's bilingual schools, there's all this tolerance, and people are treated really well who are from Mexico in the United States. But now there's huge opposition to any sort of immigration. So what's the trade-off between those two things? I don't know, it's tough. So I think that this shows you a very extreme example of what I think is probably the most fundamental trade-off in the problem of global justice, which is the trade-off between openness and equality. So, Roman, do you want to just try to summarize what we've sort of said about the trade-off between openness and equality? Yeah.
There are more people going to come, and that is going to generate some inequality. So you say in the last slide some examples.
Yeah.
But I have another.
Yeah. Yeah.
Spain nowadays, or Spain 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That they were open to receive any Latin Americans.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of discrimination.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's like the trade between openness and equality.
Yeah, that's a good example, and there's lots of good historical examples of this as well. So one great example of this is you talk to a European. You talk to one of these guys over here, and these guys will say, "We're so great, you goddamn Americans. You guys are all have no sympathy for any poor person. You just, throw them onto the street. You guys are just terrible," right? And yeah, that's sort of true, right? Maybe not so true, but sort of true, right? But on the other hand, the minute that some Arab guy shows up in France, they throw him into jail. They burn his god in the streets. You know what I mean? That's the way that they treat someone like that, right? So it's not, whereas in the US, yeah, maybe we're not so great to Muslims, but we're a hell of a lot better than the Europeans are, right? So America may be much less equal, but if you think about the amount that global inequality has been reduced by America, it's just vastly greater than Europe. I mean, Europe, it's like you take someone who's a little bit poor and you make them the same as someone who's a little bit rich. In America, we've taken huge numbers of people from all over the world who are desperately poor and brought them into the global middle class. That's a tremendous accomplishment in terms of reducing global inequality. Now, I think once you think about that, the European self-righteousness seems a little bit overblown, I think. On the other hand, think about the US before the 1960s and the US after the 1960s. So if you listen on the radio or on podcasts to some leftist economists from the United States, they'll talk about how great everything was in the United States before the 1970s or the late 1960s. They'll say, oh, we had all these egalitarian policies, taxes were so high, economic growth was so high, everything was great. Except that 65% of people in the United States were completely excluded from work and a normal human life, right? Black people and women were totally outside of the system, right? So maybe that wasn't so great, right? And it seems to me that the rightward turn in the United States, all these libertarian things, this dramatic increase in inequality in the United States, to a large extent was a reaction against this. That is, people said, look, we're not allowed to explicitly discriminate against black people anymore. Why don't we say that instead we don't believe in discrimination, we just believe that government is a dead weight on the economy, and so we shouldn't have any redistribution. Now, we didn't believe that in the 1950s and 1960s when black people didn't get the redistribution, right? And now that black people do get the redistribution, suddenly we believe in libertarianism. Now, I think that those things are, of course, there are people who believe in libertarianism for ideological reasons. There were people who in the 1950s, there's Milton Friedman and all these people. But I don't think those were the people whose views changed that caused the US to change its policy. I think the people whose views changed are the people who didn't want to be redistributing to the black people. And the way you can tell that is the sections of the country that overwhelmingly favored segregation were the ones who became overwhelmingly in favor of libertarianism, right? It used to be, in fact, in the 1930s that Roosevelt had a coalition of people who were in favor of segregation and in favor of redistribution. And that's how he won the country. And then, once they got rid of segregation, suddenly all those people moved to the right and became libertarians. Another great comparison, which goes the other way for the US, is that what we all learn in schools in the US, the story that we're all told is, yeah, there was lots of racism in the US in the 19th century. That was bad. But, you know, we had this idea of equality, you know? And in the end, that idea of equality triumphed, right? Whereas the British, they had this class-based system and, you know, they were really bad, right? But think about it. You know, the US had this whole egalitarian rhetoric. In order to sustain that, we basically had to exclude from the population a whole bunch of people so that they were just treated like total dirt, right? On the other hand, the British system, which had this whole class hierarchy, yeah, it was more inegalitarian in some ways. But if you were a black person who came into British society, you were basically in the same position as any other lower class person. So which one of those was worse? Well, all these things depend on the trade-off between openness and equality. Which one is more important to you? I don't know. It's something to think about. Okay. So, Danielle, do you want to give your view on this? Do you have any thoughts?
Basically, the problem is that you want to open because it will be expensive for you to give equity to these people.
Yeah.
And it depends on time. So they're
Yeah.
early stages.
Yeah.
And they are a citizen.
Yeah.
In the later stages. If you could find a way not to put a mark, that would be racist.
Yeah.
But if you could rotate the people who go into your country so that they say only a certain, the first part of your dirt, let's say,
Yeah.
you could have non-racist, open, but not totalitarian system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how comfortable people would feel with it, but maybe. I mean, that's the idea behind some guest worker things. Maybe that would work. I'm not sure that you could really sustain it without racism because these people would be coming and you'd want to be, but I think some Middle Eastern countries have tried to do that with workers from India, for example. But yeah, Gabrielle.
Well, I think that, I don't know if you're pointing the right way to think. Because when you put your example on black people who were brought as slaves to the United States and
Yeah.
places, and then show that probably now they're better in the United States and then
Yeah.
process it. That's probably what's happened. But it's not probably what could have happened if other factors were taken into account. So the problem is, I'm going to try to say something. The problem is that the difference between countries split more and more in time. Robinson has some works on that and all this. And well, we did do it in that time in the 17th century and all that. And we're not doing it now. We are living the same thing happen, so that type of phenomena will still be happening. Yeah, we're not changing the way the countries differ. So maybe I'm trying to think something like a new way of thinking and development, or this type of things that to be the solution. But I don't have it. But I like it.
So again, Gabrielle, I agree with you that that's a good thing. I just don't think it'll solve this problem. Like, I just don't think it's too easy of an escape that you're trying to give. You know what I mean? It's like, I agree that is right. There are good things to be done there, and I think that they're great. They're just not going to be enough to solve these trade-offs. These trade-offs will continue to exist.
What I'm saying at this point is that it is not because of racism that Black Americans are being treated better. I don't think that is a right conclusion. It may have happened, but it may not have that
Look, we can disagree about particular historical examples, There's no question that there's lots of factual issues. I think I probably disagree with you about this particular historical episode, but there's no question that at least as a matter of possibility, this sort of stuff can occur. And that these are real trade-offs that exist. I mean, maybe in particular historical episodes it goes more one way than the other. But these are real issues that you have to grapple with philosophically when you think about trade-offs between different social organizations. And I think it's very easy to try to avoid them by trying to give, in particular factual cases, a story where they happen not to arise, because it's very uncomfortable to think about these things. But I think if you want to be intellectually honest, you have to force yourself to confront them. But,
I'm not going to take more of
yeah.
the time with the class, but I have something.
Yeah. Okay, so let's explore another problem with the standard approach. So Oskar thought it was very unrealistic to say that people all had the same tastes and that they only differed in ability. Imagine that instead, some people want money and some people want love, right? We know that the Beatles, within a couple of years, changed their opinion on this, right? So it seems reasonable that different people might differ on this throughout their lives, right? So the question is, should we redistribute from people who want money to people who want love? Imagine we see one person who's really rich and another person who's really poor. The person who's really rich is rich because they wanted money in life. Yeah, the person who's poor is poor because they didn't care about money. All they wanted is love in life, right? In fact, you would think it's almost the other way around. You think you should redistribute from the person who wants love to the person who wants money, because they don't care about money, and the person who wants money cares about money, right? So if some heterogeneity is in terms of ability and some heterogeneity is in terms of taste, that's really going to dramatically reduce how much redistribution we want to do. So Ben Lockwood and Matt Weinzierl, who we talked about before, talked about the effect that this would have on optimal redistribution. And they find pretty intuitively that the more that heterogeneity is in terms of taste that generates inequality, the less you want to optimally redistribute. And basically they found that this roughly cuts in half the optimal tax rate if half of the inequality is due to taste rather than to wealth. Another interesting prediction of this theory is across countries. Imagine we find a country where people are very homogeneous in terms of how much they think work versus leisure is what makes a good life. Then you should think that in that country there will be a lot of redistribution. In another country where it's very heterogeneous, there should be less redistribution, right? And they find that this is a very strong effect. In fact, 25% of the heterogeneity across countries in terms of their redistribution can be accounted for by the heterogeneity in people's responses to the survey question, what do you think is most important in life on a scale of 1 to 5? Having a good life outside of work, or working hard and enjoying the fruits of your labor? So here's the results. So this is the variance of the reported preferences on the horizontal axis, and this is the social expenditures as a percentage of GDP. So there's an extremely strong relationship between heterogeneity and social spending. So that's an interesting finding. Another cautionary argument comes from Dworkin, 2002. So think of how we would respond to the height tax. One way you could think is that someone's height is a characteristic of them that really belongs to them, right? You can't really think of someone going behind the veil of ignorance and not knowing their height already. It's not like some superficial accident that you'd want to get insurance for. And this seems to be a sort of broader intuition. So a brilliant child who's born into a poor family, we usually say, oh, isn't it a shame that he didn't have access to all the great things that, he was so brilliant. We lost the chance to have this brilliant guy, right? On the other hand, when we have a rich child who's born stupid, we don't say, oh, isn't it such a tragedy that this guy was born so stupid and was in this rich family, right? On the other hand, similarly, if there was a beautiful woman who got into an accident and is now really ugly, we say, oh, isn't it so terrible that she ended up getting this accident, now she's ugly. If someone's born deformed, we just say that they're deformed or ugly, right? So that idea, I think, is a way of dramatizing the notion of what people mean by equality of opportunity. That there's sort of some things that people take behind the veil of ignorance. And what we want to do is we want to give each person an equal chance to realize their God-given potential. Now, what's their God-given potential? I don't know. So the question is, where do we draw the line? You know, is it your genes belong to you, and then anything that happens to you after you're born doesn't belong to you? Well, what about stuff that happened to you in your mother's womb? Does that belong to you or not? Does your basic upbringing by your parents belong to you or not? Does your culture belong to you or not? Does your nation belong to you? I don't know. I mean, so what things do we want to redistribute and not, right? And how is that going to change when some of these things that we're used to saying you're born with, you might be able to buy? So what if your parents can change your genes someday? Maybe not that far off. If you want to be able to talk about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes, you have to have some way to answer these questions. Because what does it mean to have equality of opportunity for your God-given talents if your God-given talents were also just given to you by luck rather than to someone else? Okay. One last argument against egalitarianism is a bit more pragmatic than this. So we discussed before that it might be good that we have wealth that's widely diffused so everyone can develop their human capital and so forth. And that's a very nice story. Equality and growth go together and so forth. But a very opposite argument has been very common throughout history. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the notion of primogeniture versus equal division of property to children. But Germanic cultures typically had the right of primogeniture. The first son got all the property. On the other hand, Gallic cultures and Celtic cultures typically equally divided resources. And that led to many more, and some would say inefficiently small plots of land. Now, which one is more efficient of these? Well, you know, the Benaboo story is, oh, it's great, you know, everyone can develop their human capital and whatever. But a lot of people think that concentrated land holdings were key to the development of the Industrial Revolution in Britain rather than France, because it allowed people to put together these big plots of lands where they could build factories. Whereas in France, everything was so divided up that all you could do was this subsistence agriculture. And in fact, Melissa Dell has some beautiful evidence about this. So she looked at the Mexican Revolution, and she found that places that were more revolutionary against the government during the second phase of the Mexican Revolution got broken up into much smaller land holdings. And that was caused partly by places where there was a drought. And so she was able to show that places that got broken up into these small land holdings are much less developed even today. Some people, so that's saying it's just inherently beneficial to have these more concentrated forms of wealth because they allow for more economies of scale. So that's another argument against egalitarianism. Now, social Darwinists go even further. They say that people who make money, even if they make it through theft or whatever they do, they're more able than other people. And they're going to do better things with that money than other people are going to do with it, right? And if that's true, there's an even more extreme argument against egalitarianism, right? Now, of course, that depends on there being a strong correlation between the way that the people made the money and what they end up being able to do with it. So that's interesting. Okay. So I've just given you a relentless assault on egalitarianism, right? So let me try to give you a very different story for why we might have progressive taxation that's totally different than these egalitarian stories. Okay. This comes from some work that I'm doing right now. So this is sort of based on the idea that the wealthy are just stealing. Okay. So when I graduated from college, about 40% of my class went into finance, went to work on Wall Street. And about 85% of the engineering school did. So many people, including myself, believe that much of what goes on in the financial services industry is basically a form of theft. It's like getting information 1 second faster than someone else so that you get the profits rather than them, or basically facilitating various forms of gambling by people taking bets on complicated things that they really have no interest in taking bets on. And in fact, the finance industry is now about 9% of the US economy, whereas it used to be about 3% during the 1950s. So my view, and I think the view of many people, is a lot of that is just total waste. And so here were these brilliant people who I went to school with, who had so much to contribute to society, going off and doing stuff that I think is probably mostly waste. I think there's other areas that are also largely wasteful. So I think a lot of stuff that goes on in the law is probably very wasteful. On the other hand, I think there's many professions that generate lots of positive externalities. So I think entrepreneurs, as we said in our other analysis, usually don't capture the full value of the businesses they create. They create jobs for people, they create new products, consumers get surplus, workers get surplus, entrepreneurs don't fully capture that. Another example of this is, there's a recent study by Raj Chetty who suggests that the average teacher's marginal contribution is somewhere on the order of $500,000, and they're getting paid about $40,000 in the United States. So that's an area where there's probably huge externalities teaching. I would argue that academia is also likely undercompensated. Researchers don't get too much rewards for what they do, and they can generate a lot of valuable knowledge. Though I think that the prestige they get does partly compensate them and is somewhat costly because it requires people to like celebrate them in various ways that are costly for others. Okay, so I would argue that law and finance earn a lot more monetary income than academia. And so the reason that people must choose to go into academia is for non-pecuniary benefits. It's a more relaxing life, you get celebrated, all these sorts of things. More interesting work. So the higher taxes are, the smaller is the after-tax differential in the wages between these professions, right? And that means it's going to encourage people to go into lower-paying professions. So, you know, I think this is one big reason why so many people are going into finance today relative to the 1950s in the United States. So in the 1950s, lots of people went into engineering, into academia, and so forth. Now everybody's going into finance. One big reason, I think, is that taxes are so much lower in the US. And in fact, if you compare US and Sweden, Sweden has 5 times the PhDs per capita than the United States does. It used to be basically that a banker would earn something like twice what a professor did. Now a banker earns about 10 times what a professor does, right? So that makes it much more tempting to go be a banker rather than being a professor, right? So this leads to a very different theory of optimal income taxation. Oscar Serrano, why, from a pure efficiency perspective, given the story I just told, might you want to have highly progressive taxes? Why, given the story that I just told about the people in finance and so forth, might you want to have high and progressive taxes? Progressive, so that means taxes on people who are making a lot of money and lower taxes on people who are making.
I would prefer to tax more the ones that earn more income.
Yeah.
That would be like more efficient.
Why?
Because it would be fair based on what they earn relative to what the professor would earn. So a progressive tax would like the externality would be
Internalized. Yeah, that's right. So what would happen is that suppose you can't do profession-specific taxation for political constraints or because it would be too easy to misrepresent your profession, then you can use the income tax as an implicit Pigouvian tax, right? Because if the people who are earning more money are on average generating more negative externalities and less positive externalities, you can tax them more just for earning more income because that's indicating that they're probably generating more negative externalities. So I'm currently working on this, but our preliminary things show that if you take my personal views about the externalities of different professions and you compare them to the views that someone from the Tea Party would have, that makes a much bigger difference in terms of the optimal tax rates than does any of this stuff about elasticities or redistribution. That basically, under my view, you're getting up to like 90% taxes on people earning over, you know, $500,000 or $600,000. And under the Tea Party view, you actually have negative taxes on those people, because people who are earning $100,000 or $200,000 are probably working for the government or in some really inefficient thing like academia. And people earning above that are like doing great things like creating new financial derivatives, right? I'm going to finish up because I've got to finish up and we can talk after class. Okay, so today we discussed a huge range of issues in determining optimal taxes. And we started from a canonical perspective on redistribution, which for many years has really been the exclusive focus on measuring these elasticities and solving the model. And this was technically complicated until the work of Diamond and Saez, which led to the simple elasticity formulas that I told you. So it attracted most of the attention. This model is useful, but my guess is it's much less than 50% of the relevant picture. These days, most of the focus of the work on taxation is about complex dynamic extensions and solving the models and so forth. But my argument would be these are probably not the biggest issues. Probably the biggest issues were the types of things we talked about in the last hour. And almost all of those issues have been very partially, if at all, explored in the formal economics literature. So I think this is an extremely important and interesting direction for future research. And I hope that as a broader lesson, you guys won't get too bogged down in technical issues. Just because a model is hard to solve doesn't mean that the conclusions that come out of the model are important to things in the real world, right? Try to figure out what are the biggest substantive concerns in a simple way, and then only delve into the technical details if you really think it makes a difference for the conclusions that you're going to get. But I hope some of you will consider studying some of these issues because I think they're very socially important. Thanks.
It's a very short question.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the relation between academia, innovation, and market. Are you focusing on that in your studies now?
No, I'm doing a very reduced form thing where we're just saying the different professions have different externalities, and based on what you plug in for those externalities, it'll tell you what optimal, pure efficiency-based, not redistribution-based social income taxes would be.